Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 10th of November, where we are continuing to discuss Dracula. And I also wanted to remind you that registration began yesterday, Tuesday, the 9th of November. You can see in the notes below that I've indicated a link where you can access the course schedule, and you can just also go on your own on the GCC website and access the course schedule, both for the spring as well as the intersession. The intersession happens to be that period of time in January when we normally don't hold classes. And you could take a class during that holiday period, and it would be the equivalent of what you would take in a 16-week semester. It would be highly condensed. So you would be basically meeting for 3.5 weeks in January, and you would be meeting Monday through Friday for several hours a day. Again, highly condensed. However, it does serve a certain population. I happen to teach a class that is offered in that format, a public speaking class, that I think usually what ends up happening is that you end up having pretty dedicated people in these sorts of classes. So I think that one of the advantages of taking an intercession class is that you usually are surrounded by people who are pretty serious and studious. I think they'd have to be if they were taking an intercession class. And while we don't offer certainly the full complement of classes that we would normally offer in an academic semester, you've got some choices in terms of intercession classes. And you may be interested in knowing too, since you know that I am a horror film buff, that I'm going to be teaching a class in horror film next semester. And it is a medium popular culture class in relation to horror film, and that'll be on Wednesday evenings. That's CMN 201. And I don't know if there are any Shakespeare fans out there, but I will also be teaching a Shakespeare class next semester, and that's on Monday and Wednesday from 8 to 9:15 and in the morning. And if any of you are just great fans of literature, you may be interested in knowing that we have a liberal arts English degree, which means that what you can do when you are pursuing your liberal arts degree is devote most of your electives to literature classes, 6 literature classes in total, and then you can graduate with a concentration in English. And I happen to be the advisor for that program, but basically you could speak to anybody in the English department about that if you wanted additional information. So again, I encourage you to register sooner rather than later so that you've got lots of options. If you have any questions about the registration process, please don't hesitate to contact me. So where we are is with Dracula. And as you know, I talked about the first part of the book, and I had indicated that perhaps one of the best ways to think about Dracula, which is a long novel, is to think about it as 4 separate texts. And if you do that, then we covered the first and the second part. So today would be what I'm calling part 3 and part 4. And part 3 is what I'm calling Mina's Mystery. And this is where we shift genres. I had talked about that the first book is very gothic, if you happen to like things like the supernatural. This is the story of Jonathan and Dracula. And then the second book is more of a romance where we learn a little bit about Lucy and Mina's suitors. The third book shifts again into a kind of mystery story, which again, I think it was very clever what Stoker was doing because he could appeal to a wide range of audiences by having all of these different elements embedded within his novel. And the idea of Mina's Mystery is that ultimately Mina has become the new victim of Dracula now that Dracula has gone after Lucy successfully, although the men, quite tellingly, her fiance Arthur, or basically puts a stake through her heart. That's a very phallic idea about the stake penetrating, just like the vampire bite is also quite phallic, the idea of the teeth penetrating. And now that we've moved forward, it seems that Dracula is going to try to conquer more of the British female in particular, which is one of the ways that Dracula is oftentimes read, is that he is basically this conquering foreigner who is diluting the life force bloods of the British, and particularly the lifeblood through British women. And of course, we could also read Dracula as a kind of capitalist who's sucking the life out of the less powerful masses. That's another way of reading Dracula. And reading Dracula from a symbolic perspective, you can think of Dracula as representational of lots of different things. But if we wanted to think about him literally as actually this supernatural creature which is preying on others, this gets us to the mystery of what's happening to Mina in book 3. And in chapter 17, we see how Mina is very much a researcher. We had talked about that in many ways. She's the traditional female because she stands by Jonathan and she's concerned with appearances. She doesn't want to be seen holding hands with him in public and things of that nature because she thinks it's improper. But that said, she also is a modern woman because she embraces some of the modern technologies, things like shorthand and stenography and using typewriters. And here we see her research skills as she's compiling all of the evidence. And basically, all of these characters get to know one another through technology. And it strikes me, as much as things change, they remain the same, because we could say something very similar about our contemporary society and how many of us are using technology and the internet in order to get to know other individuals. And a quote that I wanted to draw your attention to in chapter 17 is where Mina says that we women have something of the mother in us that makes us rise above smaller matters. Again, the idea of what the ideal female would be during this time period. And there's an essay that I review in my Women in Literature class that's called The Cult of True Womanhood, that talks about the idea of female in the 1800s, and that female would have basically 4 virtues associated with her: piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. And I think that we can see that somewhat in that quote, that we women have something of the mother in us that makes us rise above smaller matters. And you've probably heard of the whole idea of woman being presented as either a Madonna or a whore, and nothing in between. And if Lucy is the quote whore because she's loose and she's killed because she is contemplating 3 suitors, then Mina is the Madonna. And again, I hope that you've had enough time to finish the novel by this particular point in time. But spoiler alert, she does live. And I think part of that is because she is that kind of mother woman, the way that she's presented in the novel. Chapter 18, I wanted to draw your attention to a spiritual phrase, a Christian phrase, for the blood is the life. And we know that this is a very Christian text. And in fact, the idea that Christianity is Savior, it's an idea that we've seen in other texts and will continue to see, certainly when we talk about something like The Exorcist, for instance. But there is a long Christian tradition about blood representing life force, which is something that we see in the Dracula idea as well, that the blood is the life. It's one of the reasons why Renfield is consuming life. That said, if you wanted to think about another symbolic way of reading Dracula, you could view it as the spread of disease, whether it be venereal disease, or even though AIDS wasn't necessarily a disease at that time period, there are a good number of parallels as well. And I can't help but think about and I believe I mentioned this previously, about the idea of a vampire and the folklore associated with bats, and our current COVID situation, where we are perhaps correct in speculating that a bat was the original origin of the virus. In chapter 18, I also wanted to talk a little bit about that Van Helsing character and one of his statements about Mina, that Mina has a man's brain and a woman's heart. The idea is that she's supposed to epitomize the perfection of humanity, that men have intellect and that women have basically love, and that she's able to embrace both. Next class, what I'm going to be doing is talking a little bit about some specific quotation in Dracula, and one of those passages that I wanted to read to you is on page 243 to 246, or at least in my version of page 243 to 246. The vampire lore that has become so iconic in our society that basically you don't necessarily have to detail much of it, but it needed to begin somewhere. And certainly the idea of Dracula detailing all the novel, detailing the lore, and then of course how Hollywood was able to take that and to make it available to the masses is one of the reasons why most people have some conception of what a vampire is and what the quote rules are unquote for a vampire. Again, a vampire isn't necessarily a real entity per se, though we had talked about how oftentimes individuals who might have been suffering from tuberculosis at the time might have been accused of being turned into a vampire, or being the victim of a vampire. Whether it be that they were lethargic and they looked very pale and very basically weak, or if someone had perhaps been prematurely buried, and as we know from Poe, that's a possibility, and then they try to work their way through the grave to be able to reach the air. One could say that that would fit in with some of the folklore associated with the vampire coming back to life. It's no coincidence, I think, that this novel, and this is in chapter 19, ends in October. This is where our climax is. And of course, as we just finished with Halloween, you know that October is such an incredibly important month in terms of the Gothic. And we get more detail about Renfield consuming those flies and spiders. If you remember Dance Macabre and Stephen King talking about the gross out, this is a great example of the gross out, what Renfield engages in. Though we'll definitely see things that are much more graphic, particularly when we get to contemporary United States. Um, Probably the biggest mistake is that Mina is isolated. And we know that isolation is always a bad thing in the Gothic. We see this over and over again. Notice how the men, as much as they respect Mina, they isolate her for her own good, for her own protection. And of course, that's what leads her to be vulnerable. I think there's an interesting commentary here on gender. The idea of not allowing female to engage in community, and then the consequences are pretty negative. Chapter 20 is where we get a Dracula connection with Renfield, which we finally see, though we've suspected it previously in the novel. And then in chapter 21, we see Quincy at one point. Remember Quincy Morris, our Texan? He's rashly goes out and tries to chase that vampire. And again, I think it's a little bit of foreshadowing about what will happen to his character eventually, and the kind of temperament that he and perhaps Americans have, that they tend to be too rash. And we saw that as well early on when he talked about vampire bats. And we see a switch here in chapter 21 where basically Dracula has Mina drink his blood. Usually it's the vampire drinking the victim's blood. In this instance, it's the victim drinking Dracula's blood. Part of that is a plot device, this role reversal, so that the idea of Mina consuming some of Dracula's blood means that she and he have some sort of a psychic link with one another, which is going to be important for the characters as the novel progresses into what I call book 4. And that's chapters 22 to 27 or so. And this is where I think we shift into an adventure novel where we've got a good amount of chase scenes. And if you remember how we were initially talking about the definition of the Gothic, and that ultimately the Gothic oftentimes examine this sense of pursuit and retreat. And we definitely see that here. This is where Jonathan shows a little bit of nobility, saying he's going to join Mina as a vampire if necessary. Of course, that isn't going to be necessary because we are going to have reestablishment of order. Chapter 23, and Naya talked a little bit about this last class as well, that there's a good amount of punning in the book, particularly when it comes to words like count or, in this instance, stake. In chapter 23, they talk about how there's more at stake. And obviously, stakes are so important, S-T-A-K-E, that is, in terms of the vampire mythology. And in chapter 24, Mina says, You men are brave and strong, but I may be of service. And again, I can't help but smirk when I read that. And that ultimately, again, I think there is an embedded statement here about female. We talked a little bit about Frankenstein and how Mary Shelley is showing us a world that excludes female and the negative consequences. And I think that Bram Stoker was on some level doing some of the same things, because it's only when Mina is excluded from the book that she becomes a victim, and when they include her when she is of some service, so to speak, this is when we are going to be getting more of a resolution. And we're told that the Count is a kind of criminal type. This is in chapter 25. The idea that someone's physical appearance could indicate that they have negative qualities or characteristics. Again, we saw something like that in Frankenstein. I think the problem is with Hollywood and film, the Bela Lugosi character came off very differently than the way the vampire probably would have been portrayed by a strict adherence to the novel. Bela Lugosi being a rather exotic and romantic looking, which works for the Hollywood perspective of giving a romantic angle to the vampire. But I don't know necessarily if it's quite accurate to Stoker's vision, who based Frankenstein, who based Dracula on things like Vlad the Impaler, the great Roman conqueror, who was known for actually eating his meals surrounded by his impaled victims. How's that for an image? Or, as I believe I was mentioning in a previous class, Countess Bathory, who was basically bathing in the blood of her victims in order to retain eternal youth. And again, think about the idea of the Christian element of blood, the sacrament, and that blood is represented by wine during communion, and then of course body is represented through the Eucharist host. One thing that always struck me in chapter 26, it's a minor detail, but I think it's an interesting and even important one. Quincy Morris is going to be left behind with Mina to guard her. One of the reasons why is because he, unlike the others, is unable to speak any foreign languages. So in other words, he can be more easily spared than the others. And I don't know if you've ever heard the old joke about languages. Someone who speaks 2 languages is bilingual. Someone who speaks 3 languages is trilingual. Someone who speaks only 1 language is an American. And that seems to be somewhat embedded in there, and that little commentary about how, yes, Quincy is rash and doesn't speak any foreign languages. But that said, we had also talked about previously the concern about that if America kept breeding men like Quincy, then she would become a superpower indeed. So I think there was some anxiety there on the part of the British about what America could be. And in chapter 27, Quincy dies to save Mina. Very noble in this respect. And then we get our happy ending, where Jonathan and Mina basically have a son born on the anniversary of Quincy's death, and he happens to have all of the names of all of the men. But there also is an acknowledgement that outside of newspaper clippings and journal entries and letters, there really isn't any real authentic documentation that any of these events occurred. And you'll remember when we talked about the Gothic that it tends to have a level of ambiguity associated with it. So if a reader didn't want to necessarily embrace a supernatural message, they could embrace some sort of a natural message. And if we wanted to talk about the idea of the vampire, there is a very small group. Granted, it's impacting more than just one person, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the Haunting of Hill House itself, as well as the semester progresses. Group psychosis. That is it possible that a small group of people could basically experience a kind of psychosis or hallucination? And this has oftentimes been used to explain things like UFO sightings, for instance, by small groups of people. And I suppose if you wanted to read Dracula in that way, you could say that indeed there really is no authentic documentation that any of these events have really occurred. But we know that the way that Stoker wrote this particular text, we should assume that there is indeed a Dracula, and that this Dracula is indeed from a long line of vampires. And certainly Hollywood has run with that idea that this is a supernatural text. This is probably our least ambiguous text, or one of our least ambiguous texts. We still have to deal with Lovecraft, which will be coming up soon. Um, I wanted to talk a little bit about journal number 4 for Dracula, because technically it is going to be due on Wednesday, today, if you're watching this video on Wednesday, on the 10th of November at 11:59 p.m., which would be lovely. But as I indicated, I haven't necessarily put closure onto Dracula either, that I wanted to talk a little bit more about quotation. So you can see in the notes below in the 3rd section when I'm talking about Dracula that technically our journal is going to be due on Wednesday, the 10th at 11:59 p.m. But in other words, if you need additional time, I don't have any problem with you taking up until our next class, which would be on Monday. And you don't need to ask for an extension for that, if that's what you wanted to do. So I leave it up to you if you feel comfortable enough writing on Dracula based on what we've discussed as a class, or if you'd prefer just to wait a little bit until I've talked about some quotations in Dracula, and then we can move forward. And we'll be moving forward with Lovecraft. And remember, we began the semester by reading Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror and Literature, and I wanted us to get a sense of some of his short story writing to see if he could actually maintain some of the criteria that he had developed in his very famous essay about what makes a good Gothic tale. And much like Edgar Allan Poe, and we know that he's a great fan of Edgar Allan Poe, he is best known, Lovecraft is, for his short stories, and he has quite a few short stories, but I just selected a few to try to give us a little bit of a sense of his world, but that's what we'll be talking about next class. In terms of our attendance question, and normally our attendance question is due 24 hours after class. However, 24 hours after this class puts us into Veterans Day, which is a day off. So basically what I'm going to do is to ask you to have your attendance question due by Friday, the 12th at 8 a.m. So note the extension because of Veterans Day on Thursday. What did you find to be the most surprising element about the novel Dracula, and why? What did you find to be the most surprising element about the novel Dracula, and why? I'll be curious to see what you come up with. Again, the kind of question there is no necessarily right or wrong answer for. I'm just curious about your thinking. And if all goes well, by next week, you should all have your papers back. So I'm in the middle of working my way through them so that we can talk about paper number 1 and also get ready for paper number 2, which won't be due till the ending of the semester, but time moves quickly. So now that we've gotten away from our major 3 texts, which is Frankenstein, Dracula, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you'll see that the pace will pick up a little bit as the readings become a little bit more accessible and a little bit less lengthy. So I hope you're all doing well. I am doing well, and we will continue on next week talking about Dracula and shifting into H.P. Lovecraft. Take care. Bye-bye.